Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading Patricia St. Tells Her Own Story by Patricia St. with permission of 10 of Those Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 20, In the Steps of Paul. When I was about 13 years old, my imagination had been captured by the story of Onesimus, the runaway slaves whose small history appears in the book of Philemon. I told my father that I wished to write a novel based on the incident, and without the flicker of a smile, he accompanied me to the public library. "My daughter wishes to write a novel set in the Bible Times," he announced to the astonished librarian. "Could you please show her the ancient history section where she can do some research on the subject?" I failed to see the wink that must have passed between them and felt very solemn and adult. I obediently researched and found out quite a lot about ancient Colossae and the Roman world. I wrote my story laboriously, mostly in pencil in a multitude of lined penny notebooks. The family applauded, but it never went further. Some years later, the manuscript, almost forgotten, was lost in a move, but the idea never quite left me. And one day, when my sister Hazel was over from Beirut, spending a holiday with us in Tangier, I mentioned this old dream. "Why don't you write it?" she asked. "Because I can't write about places I've never seen," I replied. "And when would I ever go to Turkey and Greece and Rome?" "Next year," she replied promptly. "Come to Beirut in the summer holidays and we'll drive back to North Africa together in my Volkswagen and camp. We'll visit every place St. Paul ever set foot in, except the islands of the sea." So in 1966 I left, with much trepidation, for Beirut. It was not my first visit. I had been there once before when I was still working in the mountains. After about a fortnight of enjoying the life of Hazel's school and meeting some of her numerous Lebanese friends, we set off on our first stage of our journey. The little Volkswagen was well packed with a tent, sleeping bags, premise, provisions, water container, and personal luggage. Crowds of excited friends came to the gate to see us off. It was quite emotional, but at last the gates closed behind us and we were out through the traffic, chugging east towards Damascus, with a great Lebanese range to cross. Up we climbed over the mountains with their stupendous views across the Baca plain, where the south, the snows of Hermon shimmering against the blue. Then down from that bright air to Damascus and on along the east plains of Jordan, arriving Haman that evening, where we were welcomed and entertained by Christian friends. Hazel knew everybody, and it was pleasant to tag along behind and be welcomed and entertained wherever we went. It happened again next evening after a thrilling day. I was seeing for the first time that place in the Jordan River where there was much water. Had Jesus really stepped down into that pool? And dusty little Bethany, we got out and stood on the crest of the Mount Olives and looked down on the whole great panorama of modern Jerusalem. And then Hazel explained quite calmly that we were to stay with the keeper of the garden of the resurrection, the garden tomb, for 3 nights, and we would sleep in a little summer house 100 yards or so from the grave. The country was dry and barren in August, and the garden was lovingly watered all year round. It was a mass of flowers. The Motters had a delicious meal waiting for us, and we sat for a long time talking and breathing in the sweet scents of the garden at dusk. Through the open window, half veiled by trees, was a tomb where Jesus may have laid. A few 100 yards away rose a little hill, seamed on one side with rocks which in certain light bear a strange resemblance to a skull. Gordon's Calvary, they call it, and the general insisted that it was the hill on the Mount of Crucifixion. Then there must be a single tomb very close at hand. For in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb. 7 years after the general's death, the garden tomb was excavated, solitary and empty, with a stone rolled back from the entrance. The Motters held us spellbound with the story of their recent lives. They were Palestinian Arabs who had come to Jerusalem on a holiday with their 9 children. While there, war broke out between the Jews and Arabs, and it became impossible to get back to their home. Their money was dwindling and the banks were unable to transfer. They, and many like them, were faced with the problem of real hunger. Mr. Motter visited the bank daily, but nothing was coming through from his own account. A day came when they finished the last of their food for breakfast. So Mr. Motter gathered his 9 children round him and read to them God's promises of provision in the Bible. "We're going to see if the Bible is true," he told his anxious family. "I will go out with a basket and will tell no one of our need, only the Lord. If I come back with an empty basket, then it seems the promises are not true. If I come back with a good dinner, then you can know that the Bible is a book to be trusted." He went first to the bank and stood in the long line. Like most others, he was turned away empty-handed. As he went out, he met a local acquaintance coming in. The man stopped and spoke to him. "How are you managing with all those children, Mater?" he asked. It was a temptation to tell and ask for help, but Mr. Mater remembered his promise. "We're all right," he said quietly, and went on his way. That's true, he thought to himself. With all those promises, we must be all right. Not knowing where to go next, he sat down on a seat by the roadway, his empty basket beneath his feet. "Oh, Lord," he prayed, "all those little children. There's so much more than their dinner at stake. It was their faith in God." He looked up, for someone was speaking to him. His friend stood in front of him. "I don't care what you say, Mater," he said. "You can't be all right with all that crowd to feed." He dropped a packet into the empty basket and walked away. It contained enough money to feed them for many days. The money came through, and later he was offered the job of caring for the Garden of the Resurrection, with a house on the edge of the garden. He did his work beautifully, for the place is a mass of flowers and shady trees. The next morning at sunrise, I ran out and sat beside the opening to the tomb and pretended I was Mary Magdalene on that first amazing morning when Jesus called her by her name. We had just 3 days in Jerusalem. We drove south to Bethlehem, north to the Vale of Sychar, and back to Bethlehem, and saw those old cave-like graves at the back of the village. Out of one of those, Lazarus had come forth. We followed the road to Emmaus in the evening and crossed the brook Kidron, climbed the hill to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the twisted olive trees are said to be round about 2,000 years old. It was hard to say goodbye to the dear martyrs and that quiet little flower-scented tomb. We shall never see Mr. Mater again, for during the 6-day war, soldiers broke into the garden and shot him at close range. Perhaps he had loved that spot so much, would have been glad to die in the very place where death was conquered. So on the third morning we drove again to the crest of the Mount of Olives and looked back over the holy city and started north of our first night's stop in Damascus. The hospitality in Syria and Turkey is something I shall not forget in a hurry. The landscape as one nears the Turkish border is incredibly lovely. Hills and pine forest and far views. We stayed the night in Laodicea with loving friends of Hazel's and drove over into Turkey the next day. Our aim was to reach Antioch, and we did not hurry. The roads were rough and the Volkswagen dusty. It was incredibly hot, and we bathed in a river. We were to stay the night with a well-to-do Turkish family whose daughters were boarders at Hazel's school in Beirut. We decided to stop near the town and change and tidy up and rub over the Volkswagen. We were just a little way from Antioch looking for a suitable place to stop when we saw the procession coming. 2 enormous cars hooting loudly. "I think the president's coming," I said to Hazel. "We'd better get into the ditch." We squeezed to the side of the road, but the cars drew up alongside of us and the family poured out, laughing and shouting. It was a welcome committee come out to meet their headmistress. We followed them back in our disreputable little vehicle, feeling extremely scuffy, and they led us to the most expensive hotel in Antioch. That evening we feasted in their home, and in the morning they took us to see the sights of Antioch. It lays among hills, a small town, but in the days of St. Paul it was the 3rd largest city in the world. Here we saw, which is probably the oldest known Christian church. It is cut in a cave, and from its mouth one can turn and look out over the little city and the green, well-watered plain of Orontes River. Inside, when our eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, we could discern the worn mosaic floor, the spring of water in the corner, and the rough carving of a cross on a rock. From the back of the cave, a secret passage leads to the steps near the city wall, for the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch, and to worship was probably a risky business. The rest of our progress through Turkey was a dream of sunshine, sunflowers, rough roads, sleepy little towns, and kindly peasants in bright artistic costumes, harvesting their crops along the way, and eager to have their photos taken. Sometimes they tossed us bunches of grapes, and once they presented us with a melon. We visited Tarsus, once a great center of learning, now a small, rather bedraggled little place, crowded with mule carts. Beyond to the west rose the Tarsus Mountains. One night we slept in a small hotel where all the residents, including ourselves, lit their ways down the long stone corridor and for the most part cooked macaroni. On another night we set up our tent in a campsite where whole families were employed picking melons. The tents were enormous and elaborate, housing grannies and babies, relatives, and we felt a little ashamed of our simple contraption, for it was small, and in any case our legs stuck out of the doorway. But we were loudly welcomed at the crowded coffee shop that night and invited to dance and requested to speak English. I especially remember a blue misty morning when we turned a corner and saw Lake Ingridir just ahead of us. Turkey's weak point is its washing accommodations. We plunged in gratefully and picnicked on the little beach. I believe we found another camping site that night, for we were getting very close to one of the places I especially wanted to see, Haman's, the old Colossi, and the site of my proposed book. Colossi sat on a high mountain above the gorges, the city where the slave Onesimus ran away from the service of Philemon and returned bearing one of the world's most gracious and immortal letters, the letter to the Colossians. Turkey makes nothing of the old Bible sites. It has changed the name of many of the old cities. Only because Hazel had done this trip before was she able to locate the place. We wound up a stony track high above the road and somewhat nervously entered the little marketplace. It was a riot. Tourists were almost unknown in Colossi, and an excited crowd collected. They obviously thought us very funny, and we spent a little time simply laughing at each other. But it was kind, hospitable laughter, and they insisted on serving us with free coffee at a little wooden table in the local inn. Then someone remembered there was one scholar in Colossi who spoke English, and a deputation sent off to fetch him and returned triumphant. He also made welcoming gestures, but his English was limited to one sentence: "See you fellas in the morning." We left amid affectionate, amused goodbyes and drove a little while down the mountain. It was a late afternoon, and across the valley rose the strange white limestone crags of the Pamukkale. We stopped for a picnic supper, and it was just here that our butane gas container suddenly caught fire and blew up in a small way. It was really rather a tragedy, but we laughed and laughed until we were quite speechless. We drove up the opposite hillside and spent the night in a little hotel and bathed in a hot, cold springs. It was late in the evening, and the sun was setting down in the valley of a glory of green and gold. 100 miles to the west, at the end of the Lycus Valley, lay Ephesus, and somewhere just below us, the ruins of Laodicea. No one could tell us exactly how to reach them, but when we gained the highway, we stopped for petrol. The garage man knew no English, and we knew no Turkish, but we threw out the word Laodicea, and he nodded and pointed to the rough little track on the opposite side of the road. We bumped along it for a few hundred yards, and then it was petered out into a narrow path. We pressed on foot, and suddenly we found ourselves at the edge of a field where lay the ruins of the old city. There was no mistaking it. I would that thou were cold or hot. Up above to our right lay the limestone crags, with heat emanating from the cataracts of the hot springs, a wonderful spot in winter. Over to the left, the ice-cold water from the cold springs cascade down the mountains, a perfect retreat in the blazing summer weather. Kept apart, each stream proved a blessing. Mixed and lukewarm, they would have been useless. There was clear signs, too, in the stones of the rebuilding and new beginnings, for Laodicea was twice destroyed by earthquakes. After one of these, the Roman emperor offered financial help, but the proud little city refused. "We are rich and increased in goods and had need of nothing," was the message they sent back. For me, it was one of the most moving experiences of the journey, as though that sad, poignant letter leapt to life again in the pages of the Bible, and that final offer of hope rang out across the centuries. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." We're going to read the rest of the chapter tomorrow in part 2. I love you. I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.